Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading and probably only all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, and I am coming to you from inside of a rotary phone. It's kind of weird, but here I am. And I am in my natural habitat, which is sandwich in one hand and severed head in the other.
Yeah.
So that's how you can find me. But I am not patrolling this grocery store alone, am I? Who's here with me?
Well, it's me. This is Steve Guntley, and I worked my way up from the butcher shop, and now I'm co-owner of this podcast, which is pretty cool. This is the podcast about box crushers, meat hooks, and, of course, severed toilet feet. And that's because this is a podcast about Intruder, the supermarket slasher film from 1989 that is also a secret Sam Raimi movie, which we are going to get into. But, of course, we have an amazing guest here joining us to talk about this movie. Jared, who's here with us today?
Oh, we sure do. So the person here with us is editor and writer, content creator. Really needs no introduction. You know him best, I'm assuming, as the host of the incredible Evolution of Horror podcast. One of the leading authorities on all things horror, at least in my life, and things that I choose to listen to. I'm talking about Mike Muncer. Mike, man, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, it's a delight to have you. It's so cool. We realize it's always such an extra level of coordination trying to make like overseas calls like this happen. So we really do appreciate you taking the time and working with our schedule on that.
No, of course. I do a podcast that relies entirely on other people giving up their time to be on my podcast, including people, in the United States, Australia, other places. So I know the feeling. So I'm always happy to return the favor.
Amazing. We're so happy to have you. And I have to say, like, and not just in the amount of time that we've been doing the show, but I think just in general, my circle or sphere of podcast listening has gone down so much. I feel like there were shows, dozens of shows that I looked forward to that were dropping weekly, and I somehow kept up with them. And now it's like I have to just pick and choose. What are the few here and there that I actually keep up with? And Evolution of Horror, Mike, I've mentioned this to you in comments and stuff before. It's become annually my beach podcast. So over the summer, whenever I take my trips to the beach, I usually bring a book with me, and I always play whatever the most recent Evolution of Horror is. And I tend to go back and re-listen to some of the series. And so for any of our listeners, really quickly, who are unfamiliar with the podcast, Mike, just tell them a little bit about what your mission statement is, but also how it's presented, because it isn't just picking and choosing anything at any time. It's got a really set sort of format to it, which I love. So tell our listeners a little bit about it.
Yeah, so it is. It's a podcast. It's called The Evolution of Horror, and it is kind of exactly that, really. It looks at the history and the evolution of the horror genre. And I started it in 2017, so it's coming up to 7 years, which is insane. I started it in 2017 essentially as a way to go back and look at the history of horror from its early origins, from kind of silent cinema all the way through to now. So each week I am joined by a different guest to talk about a different movie, and we go chronologically week by week through different subgenres. So we did a whole first series on slasher movies from kind of early cinema through to present day. Then we did ghost movies, zombie movies, folk horror, body horror, vampire movies, all of that kind of thing. So it is like an exhaustive very much kind of completist view of the genre from beginning to end. And there's still so much ground to cover. 7 years later, I feel like I've already scratched the surface.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's so cool to know that there's still so much content coming, because the show is a delight to listen to, regularly included on lists of the best horror podcasts. And I'm going to stop kissing your butt now, I promise. But we are
Please
very
don't.
excited.
I love it.
Yeah. We're very excited to have you here for sure. And we're excited to be talking about this movie because Intruder is a truly weird little gem of a movie that I have to admit, I was not on board with. I saw this movie for the first time, I think 2 years ago. Every Halloween, I'll watch a new horror movie every day in October, and I'll post a review on my Instagram. And sometimes I don't know what it is. Maybe you're going into it with the mindset of I need to be critical of this movie. And, if you start with that with this movie, you might, find a flaw or two. You might find a couple areas where it's a little shaggy, where it's maybe
That's
not
fair.
very professional. But I think the intervening months and years of watching a lot of Full Moon projects, a lot of Empire projects, has really made me kind of put this movie in perspective, and I can really appreciate a lot of what it's doing. I had a much, much better time with it the second time around.
Yeah, this movie was a point of contention for me and Steve when we were podcasting together before this show. This movie came up in conversation, and as you can see, Mike, I am in fact wearing an Intruder shirt.
I love it.
Because
Look at
our
that.
listeners have come to expect a certain level of commitment from me every time.
Which I love too, because this is not a visual medium. We are not putting out
not.
no one can see this except for us. It's just, I hope that the people listening can feel the vibe of your shirt at any given time.
Yeah, and when we came upon Intruder in conversation, and Steve kind of was like, or maybe I saw your Instagram review and immediately angrily texted you like, "What the fuck are you talking about, man? You're wrong about this this movie." And it would
And then
even
he shoved me in a box crusher. It was really rude.
It did, yeah. Your reconstructive surgery was really exhausting, but here we are.
It was. It worked out.
And I remember being like, looking as we were doing this show, knowing we were going to get to Intruder eventually, and just being like, man, I really hope Steve changes his tune on this one, or I can't wait until we have the episode so we can actually like duke it out, because Steve and I tend to be a little bit of a hive mind on a lot of these projects, and we are very agreeable on a lot of things. That rarely to this point in the show have we had much of a disagreement on the way we feel. Maybe little aspects of it, but not so much like one of us loved a movie, one of us hated a movie, and that has not happened yet, and it will happen eventually. I promise everyone who's listening. But no, yeah, Intruder is an interesting little gem, and so Steve saw it 2 years ago. Interestingly, I only saw it a few years ago for the first time too. Normally, like, my history with a lot of slasher movies goes back way further than that, but this was one that eluded me somehow, and I went to a horror trivia, and there was a question about Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and it was grocery store, and not thinking it through, my teammate and I put Army of Darkness.
Yeah.
And we were wrong. The answer was Intruder, and I remember being like, I don't know if I know that movie. And so I looked it up, and I think literally the next day I found it, I watched it, and I went, how? Knowing what I know, liking what I like, how did I miss this movie? And it immediately became one that I look back on really fondly. And I'm going to say over the last few years, I've seen it a handful of times, and there's aspects of it I really enjoy. So Mike, we want to know, I've loved talking about, because we think across the pond, everything is obviously different, but then we found out that Stevie Webb and Becky Dark had very similar humble beginnings to us as video store kids. Where do you factor in here? Like, when did your journey with horror really start? And then where was Intruder along the line here? When did you stumble across this one?
Yeah, I think I'm the same as Stevie and Becky and so many of us. We were all of a certain age where we grew up in the kind of probably the early. I was born in the sort of mid to late 80s, so I grew up in the early to mid 90s. Really was my real sort of coming of age period, and I lived in our local video store. Like every spare minute I could get was there, particularly browsing the horror section, right, looking at all of those incredible, kind of video boxes, the artwork, and like so many people, slasher movies were kind of my gateway as well. Like my foray into the genre was Scream. And then I kind of went back after Scream and kind of checked out some of the earlier stuff. The big ones, first of all, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, kind of watched through all of those, Halloweens. And then kind of it was discovering, the weird, wonderful, again, whatever was available in my video store at the time, really.
Right.
The My Bloody Valentines and the Sleepaway Camps and those kinds of movies. Intruder wasn't until I did the podcast, actually. So, as I mentioned, the first season of the podcast was about slashers. It's a kind of fascinating subgenre, really, in so many ways. The slasher, the way it has these kind of extreme kind of highs and lows, and that incredible boom that it had of popularity in the early 80s, where we got literally hundreds of them, right, between about 1980 and 1983. Very quickly fizzled out. It had a bit of a comeback in the mid 80s with Elm Street, and then by the late 80s, we called it on our podcast the slasher slump. It was kind of like the time when, like, people had kind of lost interest. We were into the the sequels like Jason Goes to Hell and Friday the 13th, Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, and all these kinds of movies where it felt like those franchises were sort of dying a death a little bit, right?
Right.
But when kind of researching that particular era on my podcast, it was finding these little gems here and there, like these weird ones that people didn't necessarily know about, that were these last kind of weird little hurrahs of the 80s slasher movement. And Intruder was definitely that, I think, isn't it? I mean, it is. I think it's partly, one of the things that people talk about with this movie, the people involved in it, right? People mention, Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and people like that, and that's kind of its thing, isn't it? Really, I mean, beyond that, it's a pretty standard 80s slasher movie, but it's really fun, like really, really fun. And I think in a lot of ways, it feels like it belongs more to that early 80s kind of slasher movement than it does later in the decade, if that makes sense.
It does. I was realizing watching it this time, this is a movie with, at this point, a couple of like recognizable horror figures, like people who are sort of making a reputation in the horror world. They weren't like exactly brand new at it, but this has that feeling of like a scrappy little indie production that you make on the weekend with your friends, it has that energy to it. Even though it's just like some of your friends are now like, up and coming major filmmakers, like that. I think that's just a cool sort of energy to it. Let me get into a little backstory on how this little film was made and explain how this is a secret Sam Raimi movie. Intruder was released on January 27th, 1989. It's directed and written by Scott Spiegel and stars Dan Hicks, David Burns, Elizabeth Cox, Renee Estevez, Sam Raimi, Ted Raimi, Burr Steers, and of course, a very little cameo from Bruce Campbell. The director and writer here is Scott Spiegel, so longtime horror fans will know that name because you've probably seen it in the credits of Evil Dead 2, the 100 million times you've watched it. He's the co-writer of that film. He was high school friends with Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell in Walnut Lake, Michigan. The three of them were obsessed with horror movies from an early age, and they made their own short films in their free time. And they once even filmed a short slasher movie called The Night Crew at a Walnut Lake market where Spiegel was working as a bag boy. So they would go in after hours and shoot this little short horror film. So after high school, he joined Raimi and Campbell in their Hollywood pursuits. And he was briefly a housemate. I never get tired of mentioning this rooming situation in the early 80s, where Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, Kathy Bates, Holly Hunter, Joel and Ethan Cohen, and Frances McDormand all shared a house. Scott Spiegel was a part of that crew. And even further, he would go on to be roommates with Bob Murkowski, who's an Oscar-winning editor, and some low-level nobody named Quentin Tarantino. Nothing ever happened with that guy. Actually, Scott Spiegel was the one who introduced Tarantino to his longtime producer, Lawrence Bender, who produced this movie and has a small cameo as one of the cops. So, Scott Spiegel, kind of a weirdly connected guy in the film world. And so after the Evil Dead films came out and kind of became cult classics, Spiegel wanted to expand his high school short into a feature-length film. And so he used the small amount of clout afforded to him with his newly ascendant friends to get Night Crew off the ground. They had a budget of $130,000, which was really small for most any movie. Even in the 80s, that's a really small budget. Spiegel and his buds, including Sam and Ted Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and Evil Dead 2 star Dan Hicks, shot the film in a Southern California grocery store at night, and they stocked the whole thing with damaged goods from a delivery service that removed damaged or spoiled food. So the distributors, when this finally got finished, they insisted on changing the name from the Night Crew to the more generic Intruder because they wanted to be clear this is a slasher film. And I do feel like that's a mistake. It's bad for your SEO. It's bad for the kind of vibe of the movie. I don't know if Night Crew is the way I would go either, but there's got to be a title in between those.
Well, there is a title in between, Steve, and this is our friend Charles Band getting involved here.
Yeah,
trying to have Intruder be, one of the Empire distributed movies right at the time, right before Empire was to go bankrupt. He suggested that a subtitle be added to the Night Crew, The Final Checkout.
Okay.
And that was
Better.
Charles Band's, his idea for that one, which I like. And so, yeah, this movie was intended to be an Empire release. It basically ended up being one of three movies Charles Band kept to himself in the Empire collapse. We talk about like Trancers and how he held on to the rights to that. But there was a couple of small movies that he ended up having kind of free reign with and used them as kind of a bargaining chip to get that Paramount deal for home video. And so for this movie, Paramount were interested, but they're, a little bit of a conservative distribution company. And so they said, with the caveat, like after it had its incredibly limited theatrical run, we will release this on video, albeit we're going to edit the hell out of this thing. We're going to take roughly 3.5 minutes of core footage out of the movie, which is an ungodly a lot. Like that's so much for them to cut. And I think it was like in Gore Zone magazine or something, Sam Raimi had said to them, well, you just wait and see when this thing's on video, we're going to get the rights and we're going to put out a XXX extended cut of this thing, which never really happened. But the original unedited cut is the one that's most readily available now, thankfully, on streaming services. And Mike, Intruder. So you mentioned it's kind of on the tail end, the slasher kind of fatigue at the end of the 80s here. And you said it feels a lot spiritually like an early slasher movie. Like, what is it particularly about this movie that you think makes it feel more like a kindred spirit to some of the, Sleepaway Camp and stuff like that than our late 80s stuff?
I think the late 80s ones got more and more almost fantastical, right? Like I think that they were running out of things to do with that slasher format, and in a kind of post Elm Street world, we were getting things like Child's Play, and people were finding other ways to kind of make the slasher format slightly more wacky and out there, and there were higher concepts, and you had Jason Takes Manhattan, and all of these kind of things. And so, the early 80s, they were much more stripped back. They were much more kind of get a bunch of characters in a single location and just kill them in gruey ways, basically, right? And it was really all about that. It was all about kind of the makeup effects and the blood and the gore and the body counts and everything else sort of took a bit of a back seat, in terms of characters, plot, performances, sometimes the quality of the directing, you find yourself almost wanting to like skip some of the in-between bits with some of the kind of early 80s slasher movies and kind of get to the good stuff, right? Because they were made for a very particular purpose. Right. And they often had a whodunit element too, but kind of not always a great one, right? And so all of those things I just said, I feel like apply to Intruder a little bit. You've got a very, very scratchy, low budget movie set in a single location, bunch of sort of not great actors playing kind of fairly wafer thin characters that get bumped off one by one, essentially in like really fun ways,
Yeah. I mean, you said exactly what I was hoping you were going to say, Mike, which was that this is we started to get a little high concept, and this is low concept. Like this, there really isn't even a plot in this movie so much. It's the person with the stakeholding majority in this grocery store wants to sell it, and his partner with the minority holding is just crazy about this store. And that's really all it is.
Yeah.
That's all you need to know.
We get a bit of a misdirect with the abusive boyfriend, but that's just kind of set dressing at the beginning. Like really, they get all the plot out of the way in 15 minutes, and then it's like a solid hour of just kill set pieces. Like just people going about their job and then getting killed. So I think again, maybe that was something I bumped into the first time I watched it. Just the very thin plot, and now I'm just seeing it as kind of a plus. It's like they don't have pretensions about what kind of movie they're making or what we're here to see. Like you were saying, Mike, like a lot of times you would skip ahead to get through some of those languid little bits in between the kills, and this movie doesn't have that. This is just like kill.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It takes a while it does take a little while for those kills to get going, but then when they do, it is just thick and fast, isn't it? And I think it does have this kind of like campy charm that the early 80s had. It also reminds me a bit of that film Blood Rage, you know, from 1987, which again is a kind of late 80s slasher movie that is actually an early 80s one. I think it was actually made in 1983 and then it wasn't released until 87.
Right.
Ted Raimi was in it actually as well. And it's that same kind of thing where you kind of feel like, you can tell this belongs early 80s. And Intruder definitely has that vibe. Yeah.
Well, Steve and I just guest hosted recently on the Rick or Treat horror cast, and we watched a movie that I think is similar to this one in spirit in some ways, which is The Prowler, Joseph Zito's 1981 slasher movie, because it is sort of like the same thing. It's really paper thin plot, not particularly well fleshed out characters, maybe not, the most committed performances, despite what Joseph Zito tried to whip out of the cast and crew on that movie. But it is sort of serves as these little interims between some of the most gnarly gore effects you've ever seen. And I feel
that
like
one was Savini, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah. Some of the best Savini work. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I think this movie kind of operates the same way, where it's like there's these little interims, but really you get to these murder set pieces here, and I like how they sort of magnify each time. Like Renee Estevez, who, by the way, at this point in her career, I mean, she's very young, probably 21, 22 years old. She is that Estevez. So she is the daughter of Martin Sheen and sister of Charlie Sheen and Emilio Estevez. She, in like a 3-month period, had actually, I think in the same week, this movie had its limited theatrical run, and so did Heathers, where she plays Betty Finn, Winona Ryder's nerdy friend. Also about 3 months earlier, the VHS release of Sleepaway Camp 2 on Happy Campers. So she was having herself quite a couple months here, like really looking like she could have become a big genre figure, which then didn't really happen. But it was nice to see her here because she's really ubiquitous, and anything coming out in the mid 88 to mid 89, she's in a lot of stuff.
I do want to mention, like, speaking of Renee Estevez, this was not a Charles Band production. This was an acquisition and a distribution, so they made the movie and then he kind of picked it up and distributed it. But the marketing definitely bears the hallmarks of a Charles Band production, because they're putting a lot of emphasis on the fact that Renee Estevez, she's second billed in this movie, despite like being in less than 5 minutes of it. They're also every distribution, every DVD, VHS, whatever, emphasizes that Sam Raimi is the star of this. Bruce Campbell is the second star. Ted Raimi. They are all in it for a combined maybe 30 seconds, like, to be very clear. Yeah. But that's a Charles Band misdirect. It's like when he said that the movie is starring like Joe Estevez or like Estevez and Swayze, and then it's just like, is that Beach Bay or Beach Bimbos?
In a couple of weeks, listeners, you're going to hear our episode on Beach Babes from Beyond and Beach Babes 2, Cave Girl Island. And boy, does Charles Band like to bring in the siblings of famous actors for that one, just to make some money off the last name. Yeah,
100%. Like, it's a great maneuver. If you have that in your deck, you might as well use it. Weirdly, like, this made me realize that I think I first became aware of Sam Raimi as an actor, which is a weird way to go about it. But my mom, I remember being young, and she rented this movie called Indian Summer, which is kind of like a Gen X take on like The Big Chill. A bunch of 30-somethings go back to their summer camp and reminisce. And Sam Raimi's an actor in that movie. He's playing like the simple-minded groundskeeper, and he's just doing like silent comedy bits throughout the entire movie, and he's like a good physical comedian. It's just it's a very strikingly weird that Sam Raimi was just in that movie. But that's how I knew of him, and then I discovered a couple years later it's like, oh yeah, this guy makes movies, and so all that isn't to say that he's particularly good in this movie. He is in this for 30 seconds, like you said, but this definitely smacks of like just doing his buddy a favor, or doing a nice little throwback to like the old days. And he and Bruce Campbell are probably both too busy to do more than the 30 seconds they were able to give up. But it's nice to see them in here. It's nice to see Ted Raimi always. He's just got a great, like, rubber-faced, goofy persona that I always enjoy in movies. And Yeah, and then you even have another future filmmaker in here, Burr Steers, who plays kind of the surfery guy who gets put through the box crusher. He directed Igby Goes Down with Kieran Culkin and like a couple other
Good movie.
movies. And he's done a few films since then. So
Very
a lot
cool.
of hidden talent.
Yeah, it's one of those films, isn't it? I think it would have disappeared more into obscurity if it didn't have so many names attached to it that people know from other things. You know, I think it coincidentally, like you say, this guy was kind of well connected. This filmmaker, I think, right? And it's really interesting just to see who pops up in it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely really fun. I mean, yeah, like we said, the plot is pretty much out of the way already. Like it's we get a little confrontation at the beginning with the main girl and her abusive, controlling boyfriend who comes into the supermarket where she works, causes a scene. He gets thrown out, and that kind of leads us to the thought that maybe he's stalking the supermarket at night and just kind of taking his revenge, you know, just because he's crazy and violent.
Well,
but yeah,
Steve,
we learned
that's another reason why the name Intruder doesn't really work, does it?
Not really.
The Intruder, it's not actually an intruder. The intruder part is a misdirect. I mean, this is somebody who's been inside the store the entire time.
Yeah.
Who is not, you know, an outside force.
He's not. No, not at all. And like, it feels crazy to me that like this movie's biggest asset, weirdly, is the supermarket. Because there are not a lot of slashers set in this very unique environment, which has its own unique like kind of setups for kills and executions. The title should be emphasizing the supermarket element of it, you know, even just supermarket slasher. There you go. Like that's you should be playing that up, because I think that's kind of the thing that makes this movie unusual. And
when you've got another title like Chopping Mall, right? It's like hard to beat something like that, isn't it? But you need something like that, yeah.
You got to get on that level, yeah. You got to really embrace like, because this isn't a comic horror film, but it does have a kind of over the top energy that you can see that I think he's admirably not aping Sam Raimi for the most part, but like you mentioned at the beginning, Jared, there are weird shots like from inside a rotary phone dial, you know, that's just kind of just gives it a little extra energy of like weirdness to it that feels like a Sam Raimi suggestion.
Shopping cart cam.
The shopping cart cam, lots of
there's some incredible stuff. There's like the camera in the floor when someone's sweeping and stuff as well, right? Like I actually really love, because you can tell this movie looks like it was made for absolutely no money, right? But I love that they really go there with some weird imaginative, you know, cinematography. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, but you can feel like, you know, I love movies like this where it just feels like a lot of love has gone into it, I think, you know, and I think there are like particular weird visual choices in there that he didn't have to do, right? That are in there and make that film much more interesting. Yeah.
One of you guys mentioned it before, but this movie, there's an exuberance to this movie, which is a reason why I really like it, because I mean, besides some of the incredible gore effects, but this reminds me so much of, so in the 90s, when I was in like high school, me and some of my friends would mess around and make little camcorder horror movies. And we would use one of my friends, had a house with some property. And so we would use that to, you know, the best effect that we possibly could. And we would try to think of fun ways to kind of compose shots of this silly stuff that we were doing. And to me, like this, whenever I watch this movie, it makes me feel like if that had been something we continued doing, like this would have been the logical next step, this kind of movie. Like it feels like a bunch of people who are like, you know, Dan Hicks is like from Maniac Cop. So he obviously had worked with Bruce Campbell before, and I think also worked maybe with Scott Spiegel. He worked with him on The Short. Yeah, Evil Dead 2. Yeah, and The Short. And so it's sort of one of those things where it's like just a bunch of friends getting together and helping each other out, which is the vibe that I feel like you really get from both Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2. Yeah. And you get it in this movie too, although maybe this isn't as creatively ambitious as those movies are, but you still feel like this is just a motley crew of friends who support each other. And it's like, oh, you want to come be in Scott's movie? Sure. Like, and here we are. And that's what I like about it so much, is I feel like if some of my friends and I had, you know, continued making our stupid little movies into college, because actually the one of my friends who I'm referring to, went to film school and stuff also, and has spent the remaining 20 plus however many years as an editor and director on some documentaries and stuff. And so
Nice.
and we would just mess around, and when I watched this movie, I'm like, man, you know what, if we were a little more responsible and a little more disciplined when we were younger, we could have really collaborated and made something pretty fun. And that's the vibe I get watching this movie, is just they just wanted to, kind of go over the top and support one another. And the K&B effects, we got to talk about getting those guys in, those unknowns at the time, because this thing doesn't work without those guys.
Yeah, this is a movie that I think some of its reputation is burnished on the fact that it is particularly gruesome. I think in some of its kills, let's get into some of these. I mean, that's part of the fun of having the setting, is that you can kind of explore all the different ways you could use items laying around a grocery store to kill a bunch of witless teenagers. So this is a grocery store that happens to have a butcher shop and a deli. So you have a lot of different chopping implement options, and you also have the back rooms with all the heavy equipment. So we get the very memorable, very gross box crusher kill where Burstiers gets his head smushed slowly, and we get to actually see the nice little side view of that happening as it's popping. And look, it's obviously a dummy. They're clearly working on a budget, but it is one of those visceral things where you just even knowing it's fake, seeing it happen just makes you kind of squick out a little bit. And the same goes for the saw blade kill, which I think is probably the signature of this thing, and a really gross one. And also just kind of a shocking thing to happen to the supposed male hero of the movie. The nice guy, the one who's going to say, it feels like he's being set up to save the day. He gets his head cut right in half. So pretty good,
Incredible stuff, right? I think this really, again, makes this film stand out from so many others of this era, I think. I think I also love that it really utilizes the setting of the supermarket, right, as well, and all of the deaths in some way linked to some, things, items, mechanics, whatever that you might find there. It's not just a guy with a machete or something. It is directly linked to their kind of environment and surroundings, and it's fun. I mean, they must have had so much fun coming up with ways to kill people in this kind of scenario,
Oh yeah, I'm really excited and curious to see what would be on the cutting room floor, what ideas were rejected. I'm immediately, a thing that pops in my head is a lobster tank kill, because I don't know if they still have them, but back when I was a kid, every grocery store had the live lobster tank.
Oh yeah,
and drown them in that. Let the lobsters pick at you. I don't know. Do a whole food themed killing spree. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, besides the fact that this killer is resourceful, you have so many just potential ways, so many things that aren't traditional weapons to be used as weapons, which I think is great. I mean, I'm always petrified of a deli slicer, regardless. When I watch people even just making a sandwich, I'm like, somebody's going to lose a finger. I see somebody, not that you do this in a grocery store so much, but I see somebody cutting potatoes on a mandolin, and I'm like, they're just itching to lose the tip of a finger on that. But I have to point out,
my brother once split open his finger. He was working in the back room of a restaurant, and I don't know if you've seen those tomato slicers where it kind of looks like a guillotine with a big spike in it. Yeah, he had spiked it, and then he brought it down, and he damn near lost the tip of his finger on that thing.
Oof.
Yeah, wow. So you could really, there's a lot of unexplored things. Sorry, Jared, I cut you off.
No, it's quite all right. I think that story was worth it. I think it's worth it for our listeners to know about the trauma that your brother experienced.
Some real life gore.
Yeah. But I think Greg Nicotero and Robert Kurtzman and Howard Berger, the K&B guys, it's so worth pointing out here. So when we talked about the Prowler on Rickard Street, we talked about the prosthetic head during the bayonet scene where it goes through the top of the head, through the bottom of the mouth, and then when it gets pulled up and the eyes turn around.
Yeah.
And we talked about how seamlessly the transition was and how good the prosthetic head looked. I think they made a choice here to go with a gelatin head for this one. And I have never seen a prop look more realistic in my entire life.
Yeah.
I think pound for pound, this might be the best prosthetic head I've ever seen. It is so gnarly but it doesn't. I mean, there are effects when it will sometimes cut between like, the person's head and then the prosthetic, and it's like very clearly, okay, here it's fake, here it's a dummy, whatever it might be, and it doesn't take you out of the moment necessarily, because I mean, we obviously know movies are fake, and so we're looking for the sleight of hand, and we're looking at like, how do they pull this effect off, and sometimes even if the amount of gore is crazy big, you can still really differentiate easily when they cut to the prosthetic or to a dummy. Here, like, this thing looks real. His head looks real, and to the point where it was really difficult for a lot of the cast and crew to be on set when this murder took place. Apparently, it was so bad that a lot of the cast members cried when they saw the actual head being cut by the deli slicer, because it does this gnarly thing where it like cuts above the teeth.
Right.
And the angle at which it's going, like, I always think back to Mike. I'm sure, you're very closely, related to a lot of other horror podcasters, particularly. I'm sure, all the guys, the Stevie and the Mates of Hell and all of their Fulci stuff that they covered.
Yeah.
City of the Living Dead with that drill kill is really great also. But I think there's a little bit of clever editing in that one. Whereas this, you get just straight up static shots from above and from the side of this thing cutting through, and it is just the most impressive prosthesis I've ever seen. And apparently people were just like, we can't watch, even though they knew it wasn't the actor. It looked so much like him that it was physically upsetting to the cast to watch it happen.
Incredible.
No, I mean, I think it really pays off. I'm glad that they put that much energy into it. And it was a nice, like, statement for the K and B guys to just be like, yeah, this is what we're capable of, so, and now they're the Walking Dead guys, right? So they're kind of like the kings of zombie makeup at the moment. So, I mean, no, Walking Dead is still on. The original Walking Dead
in some capacity.
There are like 5 spin. Okay, yeah. I lost track a while ago, but look, the show has its ups and downs, but you can't fault the makeup on that at all. And I think Kate really does a tremendous job. Yeah,
and they use this movie as kind of like a reel. Like they were brought on sort of under the guise of like, we're gonna use this to show what we can do. And I think the pretenses were kind of like they were already an established VFX crew, but they weren't really an established VFX crew.
Right.
And they really worked hard, because they were like, we're gonna show what we're capable of here, or we're gonna do stuff people haven't really seen before. And man, they are successful.
They're going for it. And I do want to give a special shout out. We are going to spoil the ending of the movie a little bit, but I do want to give a little shout out to the performance of Dan Hicks here, who I think is really great in both modes that he's going in. Like he's good as kind of like the sort of paternal figure of the store, like early on when he's being kind of like sweet and nice and like protecting the cashier, and he's really good in this maniac turn at the end. Like it's a very physical performance. He's like running across all the different registers, and like chasing people like that, and he's just appropriately wild-eyed and crazy, and clearly having a fun time here. He was we lost that actor I think 2 years ago now, over I think he was a COVID-19 casualty, I believe, and he was great, and I think he was kind of underappreciated for what he could do. He was great in Evil Dead 2 as well. I really like that performance. One thing I'm a little less psyched about with this movie is the way they kind of recast the abusive gaslighting boyfriend to be sort of the hero of the piece, which I didn't love. It's like, I appreciate the twist that they're going for here.
Right.
He's the primary suspect the entire movie, but that's kind of a hard needle to thread if you want us to be rooting for him a little bit at the end. And we already saw him like we've had to credibly believe he was a multiple murderer already. So that's kind of a hard thing to spin on.
Yeah, I think it feels like it was more just like, oh, that's a fun twist, isn't it? That actually he wasn't the dangerous one all along, kind of thing. But you're right; it doesn't quite make us want to sort of root for him. Yeah, so true.
He isn't the dangerous one in this particular situation.
No, not so much.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is kind of weird, because it's like then when they're getting handcuffed at the end, it's like you almost still have, it's like he did help her get outside of the store, but it's like you almost hope that Dan Hicks is going to get him and that she's going to get away. Like it's more like he's a vehicle for her to escape. You really don't give a shit about him because he's been established to be an abusive piece of shit in the movie. So then when it's the two of them screaming,
I was kind of waiting for him to die of violent death, to be honest, right? Like I think we probably all were, yeah.
Yeah. You got to queue up. Usually that's the character that you're queuing up to have like the gnarliest death that you can feel a little good rooting for. You know, you could be a little bit like, oh yeah, you got that guy. Yeah, no, and then but there is kind of a nice twist at the end to a degree of Dan Hicks trying to pin the crimes on the two survivors, Bruce Campbell and Lawrence Bender showing up as the cops here at this very last minute. I imagine this more is just kind of creating a paperwork nightmare for them. I don't imagine it's going to actually stick when they get their real stories, but it's a nice little it's like, all right, well, on top of this, we're going to add a bureaucratic nightmare for you to deal with. Enjoy talking down the cops for a little bit.
Yeah,
a mountain of paperwork to come for sure. Yeah,
right. Yeah, so I mean that's the extent of what you get with that, but hey, I appreciate that they tried. Yeah, I mean, it's just a fun little goofy movie, and it's, I think, like 88 minutes, not even that. It's quite short. Like, you'll be able to get through it really quickly, and it is a movie that appreciably cuts all the fat from the usual horror movie, and they just use that extra time to cram in more and gorier and grosser kills. And I can appreciate that. We didn't even talk about the typical staging, the serial killer movie.
That's exactly
staging.
Where I was going. Steve.
And you got to mention that
right ahead of me.
Yeah. I mean, putting a guy that you cut in half into two different bins, saying half off. That's come on. You're fully exploring the potential of this grocery store theme here, which I really love.
It's so good, isn't it? It's basically like they thought up the kind of set pieces first, and then the rest of the story second. It feels like, right? They've kind of backward engineered it for these awesome moments and puns and play on, like what happens in a supermarket. Which is great. I mean, I think that's the right way to go about it. Yeah.
I mean, you could take that image and just, that's your pitch deck. That's just, this is how you get this movie made. It's just like, oh, okay, well, here's generally what we're thinking. This guy's cut in half. We've got a sign on that says half off. All right. Money, please. Thank you. That's what this movie's going to be.
And I love, one of my favorite way that a reveal is staged is when Dan Hicks. I keep calling him Dan Hicks, and I'm not referring to him as the character name, which I need to stop doing. Yeah, because I want to start referring him to Bill, the character.
Bill Hicks.
Yes, this movie with Bill Hicks. No, when Bill uses the severed head to misdirect the lead and Jennifer into helping him and grabbing his hand is one of my favorite ways that's shot, with the little help me, and then you see the side of his head sticking out of the side. I think it's the head of Danny, who I believe is the other owner, and then you get a shot from the front with him holding up the head, still going help me, and then he turns and he gives the head a little kiss on the cheek. It's just such a fun. I don't know if they told him in that moment, like, here's what you're doing, have some fun with it, and if that was improvised, because I feel like this is definitely the production where you'll have some freedom to do stuff like that. I think there's a lot of trust on this set that anything, and I wonder if, like, he, out of all the takes, if they did, however many multiple takes, there was only one take where he turned and kissed the head, and that's the one that made it into the movie. But I love that, and it's just, like, there's and I will say, I think it has a really fun jump scare when Bill comes crashing through the phone booth. I think that one gets me, and I've seen the movie a number of times, and I still kind of forget it's coming when it happens, because it's just like you're invested in her phone conversation, and they're like, "Is there an emergency? Like, do you need us to send a car?" And she's about to open her mouth to say it, and he comes crashing through, and it's just really well staged, really well timed. And there's another one too. I think maybe it's Sam Raimi on the hooks.
Oh yeah.
Gets me too when they cut back to him being right behind her and bumping into her. Yeah, I think you nailed it when you said that there's just sort of this movie, I think 100% was reverse engineered. Wouldn't it be
Yeah.
cool if we did this? Wouldn't it be cool if we did this? How about this? We're in a grocery store. What if we use this? Okay, well, what would we use that for? All right. And how would that fit into the story? Well, maybe but that's totally fine. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be one of those things where, this was a tight script to start. This is just a bunch of people trying to put together these elaborate gore set pieces, and really, for the most part, succeeding. I want to talk a little bit about Elizabeth Cox, who's the lead in the movie, because she has been known for a long time since as Liz Kern, and she had a really brief acting career, really just in the 80s. It didn't really go beyond this movie. She has a small part in Night of the Creeps, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. And she went on to become just like a television news anchor.
Oh.
She worked out of El Paso, Texas for a number of years. And then she had some other local TV personality in California, I think in Fresno, as a local news anchor. And she still does this, to my knowledge, to this day.
Cool.
And she's done it, for like the past almost 30 years. And so, I mean, I'm not going to say she has like the most charisma in the world. She's a little flat, but I think she's likable enough.
Yeah.
And so she didn't go on to an illustrious acting career, but she gets a pass in my book for being in this movie and being in Night of the Creeps. She's acted in a movie with Tom Atkins, which is more than I can say for my sad, pathetic self.
It's true. It's true. That's the dream. Let's if we're all do we have any final thoughts on Intruder? Because I have a letter here from a listener that I think is a pretty fun thought exercise if you all like to participate.
I'll hand it over to Mike, only because I feel like I've been pretty forthright in how I feel about this movie. I think, it's not an Empire movie by production, and it's not a full moon movie. I think it's one of the ones that the general public maybe holds up to a higher standard than some of your Empire stuff with super limited theatrical releases and full moon things. I think a lot of people are surprised when you mention that this was an Empire Pictures distribution one. I think people associate it more with people who've gone on to have more illustrious careers, and unfairly, a lot of times people don't make that kind of connection to people directly, working for or with Charles Band, which I think is unfair, because as we've been doing the show, we've realized there's a number of really good films that have been made under both, pre-Empire or Full Moon. Yeah. I'm glad you changed your tune a little bit about this one. But Mike, this was one, I'm not going to say that you picked it per se. I kind of hit you up with a few possibilities, and this seemed like the most kind of mainstream of those that would be the most fun for you to get a chance to talk about. And so, where do you just kind of come down on this one in general? What are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's great fun. I mean, I think, slasher movies, 80s slasher movies kind of, they serve a very particular purpose, don't they? I think I think these films are their most fun when you can watch them with people. When you're watching them in a certain environment that's going to have fun with it. I think what's really interesting about what happened to slasher movies is they stopped even trying to worry about being scary too, or being tense, or being, I don't think this movie is setting out to kind of really terrify its audience. I think it's supposed to be a bit of a fun night out at the movies, essentially, right? We're a long way now from Halloween and just how terrifying that slasher movie was to people. It's a very, very different type of a movie to that. It's kind of almost lives in between space, I think, between like the kind of Charles Band stuff and the kind of serious sort of high-end slashers, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's great fun, though. I think, you go into it knowing exactly what you want from a movie like this, and importantly, it delivers. It gives you these brilliantly fun set pieces, fun characters, fun bits of dialogue, fun cameos from people that you might recognize, and kind of images that are going to stay with you, I think, as well. And that's kind of all you want for a fun 80s slasher movie like this,
I would agree with you. And Mike, I want to ask you, and Steve too, you were talking before about the slasher fatigue, and then Scream really being the thing that kind of brought it back in That is true. As a person, as a 16-year-old, when Scream came out, I saw it. I was illegally given tickets to go see Scream. We had to have a friend's older brother buy them for us because we couldn't get into the movie here. I went, I believe, on opening weekend, and to a packed house that was absolute lunacy. It was one of the most fun theatrical experiences of my life. Everyone, I think there were a lot of people there who realized that this was going to kickstart something. There was just that energy, like, of this movie is special, this movie is important already, and an absolute blast. But you got me thinking, and like you named some of like Curse of Michael Myers, like woof, like that movie. And,
Yeah.
And so now, as I reassess things, is Hellraiser Bloodline the best pre-Scream Dimension Films movie? The Workman cut of
Ooh.
Hellraiser Bloodline? Like, I'm
God,
thinking
maybe.
of some of these titles, and I'm like, that movie, people are kind of looking at the Workman cut, the work cut now, and being like, it's not bad. And like, I feel like not bad is really high praise for a lot of the early 90s Dimension stuff that came out pre-Scream. Like, I mean, I don't want to give Harvey Weinstein too much credit for anything, but definitely Dimension putting out Scream really kickstarted all those copycats and everything. But man, that was just such a tough time and as a person who's already a horror fan at that time, I was going back and watching all the stuff from the early 80s because nothing that was new was interesting me. I was in my early teens in the early 90s and like early to mid 90s. And then it was like, well, everything sucks now. Halloween sucks now. Jason sucks now. Freddy sucks now. And I would just live in the glory days, the salad days of, a decade earlier. And then when Scream came out, it was like, okay, no, this is great. And then even to varying degrees of success, I Know What You Did Last Summers and Urban Legends and stuff were still at least had an infectious energy about them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, no, that was definitely a rough period. And it's also worth mentioning too, that Intruder is actually one of the more critically acclaimed movies we're going to be talking about. Like, to the degree that this movie has been seen, people are pretty kind to it. And even at the time, like in its very limited theatrical release, like critics seem to kind of understand the spirit of it. And, so, take that for what it's worth. It's one of the few films, a lot of the films that we talk about were not ever bothered with by critics, so it's kind of hard to be objective about that, but this is one that critics saw.
I think this is up there with like Reanimator and From Beyond in terms of like Empire stuff, in terms of critical consensus.
Love that. But you're right. I mean, like, it was it's that period that everyone thinks of as like a real rough time for horror. But it's weird, isn't it? You get two extremes because it was also the time that we were getting Silence of the Lambs winning Oscars and Candyman and Misery and these movies that some people might argue aren't horror, but they absolutely are, that were like high-end kind of A-list stars, award-winning, critically acclaimed kind of horror movies.
Absolutely.
So it really went in kind of polar opposite directions. I think Scream brought it back together where you had kind of glossy, well-known stars, high budget, starring in like proper horror movies again. And it came back together again in that kind of interesting way. But a real interesting, fascinating era, this kind of late 80s, early 90s for the genre.
I've had fun going back and discovering stuff I never really knew too well about. Like I had never watched from start to finish When a Stranger Calls Back. Until reasonably recently, like in the last few years. And I'm like, wow, that was kind of a hidden gem from what looks like a tough year. So, Steve, you mentioned before, we've got a letter. This is very exciting. Keep writing to us, folks, because we enjoy adding this to a segment of the show. So who's this one from?
Well, this comes to us from our castle freak, Pappy H. And he says, hey, Steve and Jared, having just listened to your Bad Channels episode, Steve's comment regarding the film as Charles Band's first attempt to create some Marvel-esque shared universe connections between Full Moon films got me thinking during the doldrums of my boring job. If Mr. Band put you in charge of rebooting Full Moon features as a cinematic universe a la the MCU, what few films would you choose to launch the new FMCU? Any ideas who you would want to direct and star in these films? For example, perhaps my films for Phase 1 would be Puppet Master, directed by Wes Anderson with Bill Murray as Andre Toulon, Netherworld, directed by Panos Cosmatos and starring Sebastian Stan as the protagonist and Zendaya as Dolores, or Bad Channels, directed by Lord and Miller, starring Ryan Reynolds as the DJ. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if there's a guest, feel free to give your answer as well.
Sure.
Keep on making the great niche content, and that is from Pappy H. So I don't know. I thought
thanks,
I
Pappy.
like thought
Love that.
experiments like this, you know. So like the one that sprung to mind, if I could throw it out here first.
Sure.
I was thinking the one I would want to remake is a movie that has like the most potential that didn't quite get the execution where I'd want it. So I would want to remake Doll Man. I would want to get this directed by somebody who has a good sense of comic timing and who could lean into the ridiculousness of it while still making it sympathetic. So I would want it to be directed by Edgar Wright.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Wow.
I haven't thought of a star just yet. The one that keeps springing to mind is like an obvious, easy answer that make people a little like roll their eyes. But the Chris Pratt is at his best when he is playing a overgrown child who thinks he's competent but is fucking everything up. And that's kind of what you could do with Doll Man, because the whole joke around him is that he's 13 inches tall, but he still acts with the attitude of a renegade cop who like doesn't really acknowledge like his limitations, you know. So I'm sure we could think of a better one than Chris Pratt, because I know there's a lot of Chris Pratt fatigue, but that's the one that sprung to mind because that's how you use Chris Pratt properly. Not like Jurassic World where he's supposed to be a competent guy. You want him to be a man child.
Yeah. No, I'm in agreement with you. I would do a Guillermo del Toro Robot Jocks. Oh wait, that's just called Pacific Rim. I'm sorry. That exists already. No, I'm thinking I would go. Oh man, there's a couple of things I would love to get. I would love to wedge a Skarsgård into one of these.
Okay.
Could be Bill, could be Alexander. Either one.
Stellan.
Yeah, he's got some years left in him.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, you know what I would like, and I don't know, man. Ty West's Rawhead Rex.
Okay. Yeah. I can see that. Yeah. Rawhead Rex is now a porn star going to an old barn. No.
Well, I was trying to think of someone who, or maybe like, somebody who would be able to deliver some thrills, but keep the Rawhead Rex, monster sort of in the shadows. Because I feel like that was a big problem with that movie, was that the goofy creature design was a little too front and center in that one. I would have to think about this a lot because I'm going to constantly change my answer. So this is the type of thing I'm terrible about when I'm put on the spot. Mike, do you? I know your well of full moon properties is maybe not as deep as ours is, but is there something that pops to mind in what you're familiar with that you would maybe like to propose?
Jordan Peele's Demonic Toys.
Ooh, I like that. I actually really
like
like that. Yeah, that's another good pick. That's another good like a movie that I want to like more than I do like. So I think that's another good pick for like a reboot. That's
a perfect example of a movie that I had more fun with than I usually would with that type of film, because I saw it with an audience. I think it was Stevie actually. I think Stevie did a screening of it in London, and we went along to it, watched it, quite drunk with a lot of people. I was sat with Becky and a whole bunch of other people from the podcast, and
best way to do it.
We just had the best time. It was so much fun. I mean, that movie isn't very good, but really fun. And I think Jordan Peele knows how to make, real fun comedy mixed with real dark horror, knows how to pay homage to the greats. And Us has that kind of fun house theme park kind of vibe at times that I feel like he could add to something like Demonic Toys,
Yeah, and he could inject some humor into it too. Like I think we can do away with that horrible baby oopsie voice and just give us something actually funny coming out of that baby's mouth.
I say Jordan Peele's Blood Dolls.
Oh, okay, yeah, that'd be fun too. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, I think there's a lot of good options. I'm still going to be playing around with this idea in my head and just kind of like fan casting this. So thank you, Pappy, for that awesome question. We appreciate it. And thank you so much, Mike Muncer, for being here. This has been amazing to have you on and talk about some crazy Intruder movie with you. This has been really great. So where can people find your amazing podcast and all the stuff that you do?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, you can find my podcast, The Evolution of Horror, wherever you get your podcasts. We're having a little break. So we finished the last season just before Christmas. The next season, which is going to be kind of about like animal attacks and kind of nature biting back. So we're going to be covering everything from kind of jaws to the birds to arachnophobia and all that kind of thing. That season will be kicking off in the spring, sort of March, April time. So, but in the meantime, there's a whole back catalogue of over 200 episodes. Just find Evolution of Horror wherever you get your podcasts.
Highly recommended.
Yes.
Highly recommended that you check it out. And I think I started from the beginning, actually. I feel like I discovered the show and a lot of it had already been put out. You've probably been doing it for a year or two at that point. And I went into the slasher series and I loved it so much. And each subsequent series, it's so fun too, because there's subgenres within horror that I don't realize I like as much as others. And then when I listen to people break things down and discuss them, I'm like, oh, maybe I like ghost stories more than I thought I did. And hearing people talk about it. And you always have amazing guests and your conversations with them are really insightful. I love listening to Evolution of Horror, and I think everybody here should definitely check it out if you never have before. If you love what we do, you can go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star rating and maybe a brief review if you would like. You can write us a letter at puppetmasterscastlefreaks@gmail.com, which we will read on the air. Whatever questions and weird imagined scenarios like this one, we love stuff like that. So keep that coming.
Absolutely.
You can find us on Instagram at puppetmasters_castlefreaks. You can follow me at _Giallo_Jerry or Steve at Minotaur Matador. You can find the show on X or Threads or Blue Sky or YouTube, and really anywhere where you get any kind of podcast content. You can find us by searching our name. But we are not the only podcast content that Steve has going on. Steve, what else do you have in the works?
I have another show out there called Cinema Arcade. That's cinema and arcade, one word. That's a show where we watch a movie and then we play the video game based on that movie and talk about them and contrast them, compare them. And we've been having so much fun doing that. We've got a lot of fun ones coming up for you. I think by the time this one comes out, you'll be hearing our Reservoir Dogs episode, I think. But we've got a few more like weird ones. Yeah. There's a very strange Reservoir Dogs video game that we're going to get into. So, check that out wherever you get your podcasts. And
Steve, what are we getting into? Yeah, what are we getting into next week?
Absolutely. Well, let me find out as I open my spreadsheet, which I have right here, obviously. Next week, we are getting into a double feature of Torchlight Entertainment films. We are talking about Beach Babes from Beyond and Beach Babes 2, Cave Girl Island. That's right. Back into the Torchlight, the little beaded room at the back of our podcast. We're going to be going back there through the curtains to watch some smut for you guys. So be sure to come out for that. These movies are I know these movies by reputation. They're definitely prime USA up all night fodder. So I'm excited to watch these.
Yeah, rest assured that there will be a Travolta, there will be a Swayze, there will be an Estevez. It might not be the one you want, but there'll be one. We can promise
there will
at
be
least one of all of those people. So join us next week for a double dose of Torchlight with Beach Babes from Beyond and Beach Babes 2, Cave Girl Island. See you next time.